Yeah, Gene, you've had your time showing off your detailed historical knowledge, your understanding of the context and the events and the people. But now it's time for the philosophers to shine by a totally ahistorical, nonsensical thought experimentation.
This is not my area, so I defer to you guys because I am not very philosophically inclined.
I mean, you don't say it right.
Yeah, that's how really inclined he is, exactly. All right. So this is Harris defending his view of morality, which is that we can derive morality from science, and when we do, what we find is utilitarianism, basically. Like he will sometimes when he describes his view, it sounds almost like Aristotelian ethics. He used the word flourishing a lot, but when he applies it, as with the nuclear thought experiment or the terrorism ticking time bomb stuff, it's just like really like simplistic, like act utilitarianism, that that you should always perform the action that's going to bring about better consequences, and you shouldn't worry about pesky things like rights or innate moral dignity. You should just be trying to bring about good consequences. All right, let's roll the clip.
Now, it's generally understood that questions of morality, questions of good and evil and right and wrong, are questions about which science officially has no opinion. It's thought that science can help us get what we value, but it can never tell us what we ought to value. And consequently, most people, I think most people probably here, think that science will never answer the most important questions in human life. Questions like, what is worth living for? What is worth dying for? What constitutes a good life? So I'm going to argue that this is an illusion, that the separation between science and human values is an illusion, and actually quite a dangerous one at this point in human history. Now, it's often said that science cannot give us a foundation for morality and human values because science deals with facts, and facts and values seem to belong to different spheres. It's often thought that there's no description of the way the world is that can tell us how the world ought to be. But I think this is quite clearly untrue. But values are a certain kind of fact. They are facts about the well-being of conscious creatures. It seems like the well-being of conscious creatures could be a controversial anchor for morality, but I don't think it should. Here's the only assumption you need to make. Imagine a universe where every conscious creature suffers as much as it possibly can for as long as it can. I call this the worst possible misery for everyone. The worst possible misery for everyone is bad. If the word bad is going to mean anything, surely it applies to the worst possible misery for everyone. Now, if you think the worst possible misery for everyone isn't bad, or that it might have a silver lining, or there might be something worse, I don't know what you're talking about. And what is more, I'm reasonably sure you don't know what you're talking about either. The moment you admit this, the moment you admit that the worst possible misery for everyone is the worst outcome, okay, then you have to admit that every other possible experience is better than the worst possible misery for everyone. So a continuum opens up. And because the experience of conscious creatures is going to depend in some way on the laws of nature, there are going to be right and wrong ways to move across this continuum. It will be possible to think you're avoiding the worst possible misery for everyone and to be wrong about that and to fail to avoid it. This is, in some sense, a navigation problem. So here is my argument for locating moral truth in the context of science. Questions of right and wrong and good and evil depend upon minds. Okay? They depend upon the possibility of experience. Minds are natural phenomena. They depend upon the laws of nature in some way. Morality and human values, therefore, can be understood potentially in the context of science, because in talking about these things, we really are talking about all of the facts that relate to the well-being of conscious creatures. In our case, we're talking about genetics and neurobiology and psychology and sociology and economics. Now, I view this space of all possible experience as a kind of moral landscape where the peaks correspond to the heights of well-being and the valleys correspond to the lowest depths of suffering. And one thing that to drop out of this analogy is the possibility of there being multiple peaks. Maybe there are many different but morally equivalent ways for, in our case, human beings to thrive. But clearly there are many more ways not to thrive. There'll be many more ways to not be on a peak. And I think it's rather obvious that there are many more ways to suffer unnecessarily in this world than to be sublimely happy. Now, the Taliban are still my favorite example of a group of people who are struggling mightily to build a society that is obviously less good than others on offer. The average lifespan for women in Afghanistan is 44 years. Okay, they have a literacy rate of 12%. They have almost the highest fertility rate in the world and almost the highest infant and maternal mortality in the world. This is one of the best places on earth to watch women and infants die. They also have a GDP that's lower than the world average in the year 1820. So it seems to me patently obvious that the optimal response to this situation, which is to say the most moral response, is not to throw battery acid in the faces of little girls for the crime of learning to read. Now, I think this is common sense to everyone in this room, and common sense it should be to everyone in the civilized world, except if you happen to be a bioethicist working on the President's Council at the moment. But this is also of necessity a claim about biology and psychology and sociology and economics. It is not unscientific to say that the Taliban are wrong about morality. In fact, we have to say this the moment we admit we know anything at all about human well-being. So what I'm arguing is that values reduced to facts about the conscious experience of conscious beings, and we can therefore visualize a space of possible changes in the experience of these beings. And I think of this as a kind of moral landscape with peaks and valleys that correspond to differences in the well-being of conscious creatures, both personal and collective. And one thing to notice is that perhaps there are states of human well-being that we rarely access, that few people access, and these await our discovery. Perhaps some of these states can be appropriately called mystical or spiritual. Perhaps there are other states that we can't access because of how our minds are structured.
Yeah. So, Mark, to review, science tells us that utilitarianism is correct.
So the title of his book is The Moral Landscape, which good job plugging that, Sam. The subtitle is How Science Can Determine Human Values. Now, a lot of people are going to be like really opposed from the get-go. That just doesn't seem quite right. How do you get from science to values? I thought they're supposed to be separate things. He's got a simple three-part argument, I think. My reconstruction. One, here's your premise. Moral truths are reducible to truths about well-being. Two, truths about well-being are scientifically tractable. They can be traced by things like, sociology, but especially by neuroscience. And then three, therefore, science can answer moral questions because science can tell us what causes states of well-being, and well-being is what morality is all about. All right. Now, the second premise, that truths about well-being are scientifically tractable. We might have some issues with that. We might worry that, it is scientifically tractable, but questions of well-being aren't purely scientific questions. But the real how are there. The thing that, if you're paying attention, probably jumps out at you is that first premise, right? That moral truths are reducible to truths about well-being. Because, the obvious question is, wait, is that also supposed to be a scientific truth? Because if it's not, then, what are you going on about? Now, I don't think Harris thinks that it is a scientific truth. I don't think he thinks that you can get people in lab coats to discover that moral truths are fundamentally truths about well-being. But I don't think he's that bothered by it, because to him, it's just, it's almost true by definition. It's just almost an analytic truth. It's so obvious that all you need to do to be aware of that truth is reflect. As he had you reflect
with his awesome thought experiment.
Yeah, in his awesome thought experiment. Either reflect on how much it would suck to put your hand on a hot stove, or reflect as he has you in that video clip on just how bad would it be if we lived in a maximally miserable universe.
Yeah, I actually don't understand that. I've heard this line 1,000 times. I don't understand the thought experiment at all. It's like everyone's suffering. That would be bad. Therefore, morality equals human well-being.
Yeah,
and nothing else. And nothing else. I feel like I'm missing some steps.
It's for sure, right? But it's also worth saying before even going on to address those arguments that once you charitably interpret Harris as saying that science can't tell us that morality is about maximizing well-being, then he's already not doing what he says he's doing, right? Because what he says he's doing is showing that the distinction between is and ought, or facts and values, is confused, that there really isn't this basic conceptual distinction between those two things, that it's not true that, science can't tell us this. Because if science is just telling us information that together with the right moral principles can deliver correct moral conclusions, that's completely philosophically uncontroversial. David Hume agreed with that.
Everybody agrees with that. There are no philosophers who disagree with that.
Yeah, there have never been philosophers who disagree with it. It'd be a bizarre thing to disagree with. That if we had, nobody thinks that if we found out that video game characters were actually sentient and felt pain, when you killed them, that would be morally irrelevant to whether it was okay to play video games. That this empirical discovery, all of the point of the fact value distinction is not that there aren't facts that in combination of values can deliver evaluative conclusions. That's completely uncontroversial. That's the point is just that they can't do it by themselves. That you also need normative premises if you're going to get to the normative conclusion. So, I always liked Kant in the Groundwork, the Metaphysics of Morals. Has this example about how the same medical knowledge that would tell you how to cure somebody, could also tell you how to poison them and get away with it. And so medical science by itself can't tell you anything about that, right? You need some sort of moral principle about what to do, which is actually also a nice example because I don't even remember how it came up, but when Glenn Greenwald was on the show, he mentioned that there's a sort of real life instance of this kind of dilemma that happened a couple of years ago in Brazil when Bolsonaro was stabbed, and you can imagine somebody who was a receiving physician, at the ER in Brazil being very torn about it. This guy who seems like this incredibly dangerous demagogue would-be dictator shows up with the stab wound, right? Do you actually try to save him or do you try to kill him? And, whatever the right answer is, the right answer is going to be delivered by the moral principles, not by the empirical information is relevant, right? If Bolsonaro is a good guy and is not a demagogue and is not going to, potentially try to make himself a dictator, then none of your moral principles would give you any reason to kill him. But, if he is all those things, then the moral principle might give you a reason to think that or have a dilemma. So that's just something that I think is worth circling and underlining a couple times, that if we interpret him uncharitably, then he hasn't begun to do his work because he's not appealing. If we interpret him uncharitably as thinking that science can tell us that morality is about maximizing well-being, then he's just obviously failed in that because he's not appealing to science. He's not saying that something about neuroscience shows that science is all that morality is about well-being. He's appealing to thought experiments and intuitions, moral common sense. But if we interpret him charitably as, well, no, he's not saying science can tell us that part, then his claim that he's somehow invalidating the is-ought distinction is just wrong.
Yeah, good. I want to just two things on this. First, I just want to back up because we just said that nobody no philosophers think that empirical data shouldn't inform how you behave. And let's be real. There's got to be some asshole out there somewhere who's made that argument. So that guy probably exists, but he's not a well-known philosopher. So
yeah, right. I mean, that's Cicero, right? That there's no opinion so absurd that has not been advocated by some philosopher. So somebody out there says that, but certainly nobody you've ever heard of.
The second thing is, I read the book to prepare for this, which. Fuck you, Ben.
I only had to read his 50-page free will book. Thank God.
And I have to say, this is a really common thing he does. He strawmans nobody in this book. He's really happy to treat his opponent, somebody who wants to maintain the is-ought gap, as someone who is just trying to argue that we shouldn't have any empirical information at all. We should just make all of our moral decisions based on pure principle, absent any sort of experience, which of course is bullshit. Nobody makes that argument, right?
Yeah. Also, by the way, worth noting that he is assuming in the clip that we just watched that disagreeing with him means being a moral relativist. Those are the two choices, right?
Or your options are disagree with him to be a moral relativist, or disagree with him to be a religious nut job.
Right.
Those are the options. He doesn't seem to recognize that there's a whole range of different ways you could be a moral realist.
Yeah, right? I've heard him make this move, and I'm curious if he does this in the book because I haven't read The Moral Landscape. But I've also heard him try in debating. He was on Very Bad Wizards and he was debating Tamler and Pease about this stuff, and he kept thinking he got a gotcha. If he could get them to admit that consequences were relevant at all, then he thinks, you see, I've proven to you that you're a consequentialist. Well, and they're like, no, that's one of the things we have to look at, but that doesn't mean it's everything.
He's got a pack. He's done in the book. He spends very little time addressing the work of philosophers, secular moral philosophers, who just don't buy into the utilitarian principle. But he briefly discusses Rawls and strawmans Rawls. He's well, this is a really interesting thought experiment, this veil of ignorance thing, but come on, we can't say that consequences have no import on our moral decisions, which is what he takes. He needs Rawls to be saying.
Yeah, Rawls really just radically is not saying that at all.
Yeah, Rawls is really clearly not
this is actually, he has an infamous footnote that I cut and paste that's worth reading. Yeah. Right in the beginning of the book, footnote that says, I'm convinced that every appearance of terms like metaethics, deontology, non-cognitivism, anti-realism, emotivism, etc., directly increases the amount of boredom in the universe. My goal, both in speaking at conferences and writing this book, is to start a conversation that a wider audience can engage with and find helpful. Few things would make this goal harder to achieve than for me to speak and write like an academic philosopher.
He is kind of right. The way academic philosophers write is pretty fucking boring.
It's such a massive territory in between. You have to write like this. Yeah. And you have to just completely ignore what they're saying and pretend that those positions exist. Yeah. And let's be honest, probably be unaware of what the positions are.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Isn't this just an excuse for him to have not done the legwork to actually engage with these ideas?
Yeah, it's too boring. He can't
it seems like just, actually, I'm familiar with that footnote, and I just find it quite striking, as it's a blatant attempt to completely write off any philosophy as being too highfalutin. It's almost like he's trying to be, it seems like a very cheap trick to basically give himself an out for just refusing to engage with anything that philosophy does, while making very big claims about what philosophy is. I want to know,
especially because, yes, a lot of academic philosophy, not all of it, but a lot of it is written in a very boring way, And sure, there's a different way that you write, for a popular audience, than for a specialized academic audience. All true, but like surely the trick, right? The thing that makes good popular writing good is that you have read and processed and understand and can then explain in accessible terms what people are saying in the specialized academic literature. Just saying, I'm just going to ignore all that and not engage with it because it's too boring. Like
that's the best. That's the best public discourse. You're just like, this is too boring. Just I've meditated a lot. Hear my deep thoughts on this.
It's also condescending. It's like, you proles out there can't, you can have a complicated term, explain that term in simple language. It's like, there's I understand that, of course, in philosophy, there's some impenetrable language if you're not familiar with the conventions of the discipline of philosophy. But I'm sure when you guys are teaching philosophy 101 or whatever you are, you're like introducing big concepts and then breaking those concepts down into simple terms. So
that's a really good idea.
Yeah,
should try that.
Yeah, but no, clearly, right? That's what. And in fact, this is like, really what he's actually saying is like what he strawmans, the anti-war movement is saying about Iraq, that it's like, oh, it's just sad that these people, can't like exist without like a despotic, dictator to keep them down. It's like, he's saying, oh, this is, it's, look, you people are just too stupid to understand these distinctions, right? There's just no possible way that they could be explained to you that you would understand. So we're just going to have to like skip all of them entirely.
Well, that guy, what's the one who always does Marvel movies? The one with the beanie, Tim Pool. He always talks about deontological moralism all the time. So clearly,
if he can do it.
Anyone can do it, right?
Look, there's no time.
Post, I'd be like, okay, that's cool. This guy's thinking about like deep stuff and trying to come to terms with it, and that's worth it. It's even like the writing. It's pretty approachable writing. He's quite clear in places, but it's the fact that he comes to a conclusion and advocates that conclusion, and then ignores. It's like if I wrote a popular physics book where I like advocated for string theory and said just like, well, I'm just going to ignore. I don't want to get into like all the math. You would if I said that on the first page, you would rightly put the book aside and never look at it again.
Every mathematical equation is increase the amount of boredom in the universe.
They do.
And particularly if there are other physicists who say, hey, let's wait a second, what about these equations? That seems to show that you're wrong. And you didn't like, it's one thing to say that in your popularized physics book, you're not going to like include all that math. But this is just saying, I'm not even going to worry about the projection because math is boring.
There's no time. There's no time to discuss this.
And when he does in the book actually engage with real philosophers, you can tell why he wrote this footnote, because he does it in the most desultory way possible. It's almost every time he just presents a straw man of the position. I think. Well, let's push aside for a second Hume's is-ought stuff. I think it's worth returning to, but I think that this little thought experiment about the worst misery possible, I think it kind of it's captured his mind, and put him in a position where he has trouble thinking his way out of it. Because as Ryan pointed out, even if I concede that situation, as he's had us imagine, is bad. Mm-hmm. Even if I go on and concede that situation is morally bad, mm-hmm. which not everyone would do, or even if I concede that it's the morally worst situation possible, which a lot of people wouldn't do. In fact, I think I could actually make his perfectly miserable world slightly worse by imagining a world just like it, except where everyone in it doesn't deserve to be in pain. that makes it just a little bit worse, and I think a telling way, actually. But even if I could say all that shit, it doesn't get us to the conclusion he wants us to get to, where we, this premise that moral truths are reducible to truths about well-being. And I wrote a clever little thing that I'm going to read.
I did just want to parenthetically stick in that if we have the worst possible misery, except that there are a couple of sadists who are thrilled that everybody else is in pain, that it's at least not like blindingly intuitively obvious to me that that's better.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's almost as if questions of justice might want to, in some way, inform our value judgments.
No, those all just come down to questions of consequences, though.
All right. So here's my clever little thing. I'm going to now highlight what a blatant fallacy this argument is. What a bad argument this is. Imagine that a parallel argument. Imagine that you go to a car shop and there is Sam Harris. He's the mechanic. And he tells you, he's got his theory of automotive care. And here's what he says. He says, imagine a car whose parts have rusted through entirely. Every square inch of metal on this vehicle has been eaten to nothing but brittle and hole-pocked rust. It's perfectly oxidized. Now, if you have any opinion worth listening to about automotive issues, it will just be clear to you that this car is not going to run, that indeed such a situation represents a nadir, a valley of automotive health. Questions of a car's automotive health admit of right and wrong answers, and those questions are obviously reducible to questions about the oxidation of its parts. If you start with the thought experiment that a world full of misery is bad, and we concede that does not get you to the conclusion that badness just is misery, any more than if you thought about the thought experiment about a rusted through car leads you to the conclusion that automotive disease is nothing but rust. Right?
No, I think I'm convinced. So as long as you get rid of the rust on the car, you've fixed it.
Rust-Oleum is all you need.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think I'm pretty sure that just this. I mean, yes, I think that was like a much more eloquent version of like I like that a lot. But but also
I'm gonna steal that and turn it into a comic, Mark.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. And then for the next 10 years, I'm going to say that how clever that example that Ryan came up with is.
That's a deep cut, deep reference.
Yeah.
And then I'm cut deeply by it.
but also, just on a real basic level, it's the distinction between consequences are morally relevant, right? The fact that something would lead to bad consequences, is a way that it's morally worse. The fact that something would lead to good consequences is a way that's morally better. The distinction between that and morality is exhausted by good and bad consequences is the distinct, I mean, just on a super simple-minded level, I acknowledge that blueberries are blue, but that does not actually mean that I think that only blueberries are blue. I can say that and also, say that the sky is blue and, whatever, that you can think that consequences are morally relevant and that rights are morally relevant, that justice is morally relevant, that fairness is morally relevant. And you can acknowledge, like Mark said, that this actually, let's say for the sake of argument, this is the deepest valley in the moral landscape, is the one where everybody's suffering to the maximal extent. That's which again, maybe not for all the reasons that we just said, but let's say that for the sake of argument that is the deepest valley. Okay, sure, that's fairly intuitive. That could be right, but that it doesn't follow from that anything that is different from that in the single dimension of how much suffering there is or how much well-being there is therefore morally better, right? Because once we start to think about points, let's say that that's the worst, right? That's the deepest valley. Okay, how about some intermediary points between that and and I don't know, everybody been in heaven. You know, you are on a footbridge over a trolley track, and you're considering whether to push a large man onto the track to stop a out of control trolley from killing 5 people. You push him. This is like a little bit further away from the valley in respect of how much suffering there is than the scenario where you don't push him. There are fewer people who are dead, but if we get to appeal to intuitions when we're talking about how bad the worst possible suffering could be, why don't we get to appeal to moral intuitions when we say, hey, wait a second, morality can't just be about maximizing well-being, because it wouldn't actually be right to push the man off the trolley track, or it wouldn't be right to murder the healthy patient at the hospital to harvest his organs for the 5 people who need transplants. And the most objectionable thing about Harris here, and I think this could be true also for the free will stuff, isn't his conclusion, although I find his conclusion pretty implausible. It's that he's just not even engaging with even sort of like the most basic entry-level objections to his conclusion. He's just like, here's my intuition, now we're done.
I mean, it's really striking researching for this episode today, looking at like what other people have said and also how he's responded to it. And it's everyone from like graduate students with blogs to like real luminaries in ethics and meta-ethics making these sorts of complaints, often really patiently and clearly trying to explain, especially how he gets the Izot gap thing wrong. There's a nice video of him talking to Patricia Churchland and Peter Singer and Simon Blackburn, all these like really very powerful minds about his moral theory, and they're all disagreeing with him. And he has this, I mean, we've all mentioned it, this kind of arrogance. I'm sort of jealous of it, because when I have a conversation with a luminary, somebody who's a big name in philosophy, even if I think I'm right, when they disagree with me, I get really nervous and think, okay, I'm just going to shut up. He is just unfazed. I mean, it's kind of admirable in a weird way, but yeah. He's like the Principal Skinner meme. He's like, am I out of touch? No. It's every philosopher who's ever seriously considered what I think about this topic that doesn't know what's going on.
Yeah, no, there's something very similar, and we'll come back to this, but with the free will stuff, the 2 bits of research I did for the free will stuff was I went back and reread his old book from like 9 years ago. And then I listened to his most recent podcast, which was actually just a few weeks ago, where he talks about free will. And I know in the intervening time, a lot of people have objected to him. He had some conversations with Dan Dennett. And his most recent podcast is just basically, I mean, he could almost just be reading from the book. Like he hasn't changed he doesn't really respond to the problems with what he's saying. He doesn't really he just keeps reiterating the same point. He's just so confident in whatever has been revealed to him through meditation or whatever. He's so confident in what he's saying that he's not fazed by the objections that he hears.
I mean, can I just have I have a little thought experiment for him. So would Sam Harris say that if we made one change to North Korea, that everything would be fine? If we put MDMA and ecstasy in the water, so that everybody was like always like super happy all the time and didn't suffer, but we still had like a brutal authority, would that then be a moral thing? Because like people wouldn't be suffering, right? They'd be all like off their face on MDMA. So, it just like, even like if you think about it.
Is this supposed to be an objection? That sounds pretty good.
That sounds pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, like we should bring that. What do you say, Forrest? Would you go for MDMA in the water?
There actually is. This is in the literature. There is Nozick's experience machine is a very similar thought experiment that is a kind of objection to utilitarianism. Not Harris specifically, but utilitarianism in general, which is like, imagine that I've built a machine that I can hook you up to that will make you perfectly happy. Or just absolutely as happy as your brain could possibly make you. But
happy enough to have sex with Matt Gaetz.
Yeah, that happy. But you can't have sex with Matt Gates. You can't do anything in this machine. You can't interact with the world. All you can do is be happy. Now imagine that I can put everyone in that machine. Should I do it? It seems clearly I shouldn't. There'd be something wrong with doing that. But it does also seem that if you're a utilitarian, you're committed to the conclusion that you should do that, right?
Yeah. So one of the part of what classical utilitarians at least believe, there are different versions of it, is a claim called philosophical hedonism, which is that pleasure is the only thing that's good in itself, and pain is the only thing that's bad in itself. Anything else that's good is good because it leads to happiness, or bad is bad because it leads to unhappiness. True story, by the way. I'd had many years ago. I was in Miami with Ryan and a few other people, and I was extremely high, and we were.
Was Matt Gates there?
I'm
always getting nervous about where Miami story is going to go, especially in this public. But,
well, this one makes me look bad. It doesn't make
okay.
And we were somehow started talking about this. And I was like, I don't know, utilitarianism might not be true, but like philosophical hedonism is probably true. And Ryan was like, oh, what about the experience machine? And I was like, oh shit, I forgot about the experience machine. Good point. But yeah, I have. But this is an obvious objection, right? So if you wouldn't take it, and we can even like fiddle with it a little bit to like draw out the intuition more clearly, like say that the fake reality we're going to get in the experience machine, which remember you would think was real, so you wouldn't have. It's not like you would be bothered by the fact that it wasn't real. You would think it was. Imagine that the fake reality in the experience machine would only be like 5% better than the experience that you'd have in the real world. If that wouldn't be enough to get you to go in, right? Then that strongly suggests that you care about something other than happiness, that you, in this case, that you value objective connection, to reality. And in fact, I mean, if you imagine that it was going to be no better and no worse than if you really took the idea that happiness was the only thing that was good seriously, you'd have to say it's just a coin flip whether to go in at that point, which I think in practice, I think it's very unlikely that anybody would really think, which makes Nozick's point.
Now, to be fair, none of this speaks against Harris. I mean, for all the shit talking, he has a vague enough notion of what well-being is, that he can evade this problem, right? Well-being doesn't have to reduce to happiness. Well-being can be this topic, like this word like health, that is open for debate and emendation.
Yeah. Although so by making that movie, he avoids the problems with hedonism, but then he also weakens any sense in which science is going to directly answer these questions.
The problem is that to determine what we mean by well-being, and more importantly, what we should mean by well-being, I can't see how you're going to get to that without actually engaging in philosophy, not science.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why I brought that example.
Not pure science.
Yeah.
That's why I brought that example up, was because, if he reduces, because I have not read The Moral Land State, thank God.
It's a wise choice.
If he reduces, if he says that we can find like objective measures for like what happiness, if we're using science, then surely chemical reactions in the brain are the scientific outcome of what is good and bad, right? Because, yes, well-being can be broader, and like sometimes being sad about something, we might see a value and a good in being sad about something. But, how do we know, how do you know when being sad is like an appropriate thing, or you're being sad and it's a painful thing? And that's what, why I brought it up, was because, how do you do that without making judgments and having a philosophical talk? Like it seems like Sam Harris is just recycling, everything that is new is old. This is just 19th century like vulgar materialism and positivism. It's like, stuff that was like fancy in like 1890. No.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
the
absolutely.
positivists knew what the Islam was.
Yeah, that's true too. But it's also worth mentioning here that, like, I think the health analogy is interesting, but I think the more you think about it, the less it supports his point, because like, what do we mean by health, right? Like that, health is like, of course, if we're talking about what is healthy, right? Like, we already know what we mean by health. We're trying to figure out what meets that standard and what doesn't. Empirical information is very relevant. But the empirical information can't tell us what counts as healthy in the first place. And there you are going to get normative distinctions that can't be derived from the facts, like when homosexuality being taken out of the MDMA, is like no longer the DSM, sorry, MDMA. Wow.
The MDMA. No more homosexuality on MDMA.
Yeah.
No more MDMA.
Like, when we bad people take it, actually a big gay, like, that's no homosexuality being taken out of the DSM. Like, that's not primarily something that happened because we learned a bunch of new, like, scientific information about the causes of sexual orientation. In fact, like, that's still an area of very incomplete, empirical information. That's something that happened largely because of, victories by the gay rights movement and making a different, normative judgment, right, about whether it was good, right? Deciding that our conception of what counts as a good life in that respect of a good life that we refer to when we use the word health no longer included, not being gay. And you can even look at recent things like controversies about, people, like psychiatrists talking about toxic masculinity and things like that. Whenever you think about any of the controversies, like, these are clearly value questions. They're not primarily, questions about the scientific facts.
His version of values and what's good. This is the point that I kind of popped in to make with Gene's example. His point that he makes during his interview with Jank. When he's talking about it's during the torture thing. He's talking about Iraq, and he says that at one point he says that if he thought that a state wasn't ready for democracy yet, like somewhere like Iraq where there's like all these sectarian conflicts, and he doesn't feel like the people are ready for democracy yet, he's perfectly fine putting in a benevolent dictator. He thinks that a benevolent dictator running a society, like an American-backed benevolent dictator, would be more moral than letting a society that he feels isn't ready for democracy, like devolve into factionalism. So his version of what might be good, or what version of might be like his version of what might be moral, might have like terrifying authoritarian implications to it.
Yeah, and by the way, just to draw out the metaphor, like when Harris talks about health to try to justify the idea that morality is all empirical, he'll say, look, somebody could say that, like, having your head cut off wasn't less healthy, or having cancer wasn't less healthy than not having cancer, but this would clearly be an absurd way to talk. But that's not actually, like, you could say the same thing for morality, right? That, like, that, sure, somebody could say that torturing, toddlers for fun, was morally acceptable, but that would be an absurd way to talk, sure, because is torturing toddlers for fun morally right or wrong is an easy question. But then you have all these much harder questions, like about, utilitarianism versus Kantianism, and, different kinds of moral dilemmas and conflicts between principles, the same way that with health, you have harder questions like, the toxic masculinity issue, or, or sexual orientation, or other things like this. Like, yeah, exactly. And it could be, and sure, like, ultimately what he's pointing to might just be the fact that in health, like, you have fewer areas of controversy, certainly not no areas of controversy about what counts as healthy than you have about what's moral. But sure, you have fewer areas of controversy about what's healthy than you do about what's moral. So therefore, the conceptual side of the question has less to do in the health case. But that doesn't, like, I don't know what that's supposed to tell us about morality, or thinking that you could derive morality from science.
An insane amount of these arguments seem to be about justifying collateral damage too. Like his version of wellness seems to be a lot of times like, well, you know, the least amount of people suffering, but there's still going to be some people suffering. You would choose who it is and how many people you want to suffer. And like, it seems to be pretty dark whenever he's bringing, you know what I mean? Like this kind of stuff up, like science could, like, I don't know. It really is like the train example or the trolley example or something. Like he really, I think that's really how he thinks. In the same way that like we talked about Jordan Peterson constantly thinking about like Soviet torture or something as like his driving force. I feel like Sam Harris's is like collateral damage.
I totally think you're correct, Forrest. I think the guy is like deep down wants to be making those decisions. He believes that he has like the intellectual weight to make hard decisions that, you know, sometimes hard decisions have to be made, right? But he just wants to fucking bloviate about them, and deep down wants to be the guy who people turn to and ask, what is the moral? And then he can give them like an elaborate rationale for the terrible thing that they're about to do. I totally think I think there's like an interesting pop psychology thing about that Sam Harris that we need to talk about rather than taking his freaking ideas seriously.